Imagine someone capable of stopping the collapse of the universe with a single snap, not out of pride, but pure logic. What if the real villain was the only one willing to do what everyone else avoided? In this series, you'll step into the mind of Thanos, where reason replaces empathy, and sacrifice becomes calculation. Get ready, understanding this mindset might change everything you believe about right and wrong. Before he became a name whispered across galaxies, he was simply a child born into imbalance. On Titan, his home world, the skies were still breathtaking, but beneath their beauty lay an unspoken truth: everything was collapsing. Overpopulation drained the planet's resources, and hunger loomed like a shadow. While others ignored the signs, young Thanos watched, not with fear, but with obsession. Numbers didn't lie. The equation was simple: too many lives, not enough to sustain them. But no one wanted to listen. And that silence, more than the famine, more than the decay, was what began to fracture him. In classrooms and councils, he offered solutions. They were bold, brutal in logic, but framed in cold, utilitarian clarity: reduce the population to restore balance. He wasn't advocating cruelty, he believed he was offering mercy on a universal scale. But to others, his ideas were abhorrent, monstrous even. Labeled a fanatic, he was exiled. Abandoned by the very civilization he was trying to save. That rejection didn't weaken his beliefs. It crystallized them. Rejection, he decided, was just proof that most beings lacked the strength to face harsh truths. And so, a seed was planted: if no one would act, he would. The psychology behind this transformation is not madness but cognitive dissonance solidifying into belief. When someone sees a problem so clearly and is ignored, the mind adapts by reinforcing its certainty. Especially when it believes that lives are at stake. Thanos' mind began to shift. Not toward cruelty, but toward necessity. In his view, mercy wasn't sparing the many, it was ensuring that some would survive at all. That kind of clarity, over time, can evolve into a chilling form of righteousness. He didn't want power. He wanted to fix the universe. Or so he told himself. His world would eventually fall, exactly as he predicted. Titan crumbled under the weight of its own denial, leaving behind ruins and a single survivor. For Thanos, this wasn't just proof. It was vindication. The end of Titan wasn't a tragedy, it was a warning. One he now believed he had been chosen to understand. No more waiting. No more permission. He would not ask again. From the ashes of that planet, he forged a new identity. Not a ruler. Not a god. A savior, willing to do what others feared most. But there was one thing no one could see coming. Something hidden, buried deep within that logical mind. A flaw that no calculation could reveal. A fracture not in reason, but in humanity. And it was growing. It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the hollow quiet that follows devastation. After Titan's fall, Thanos wandered through systems like a phantom, searching, observing, calculating. He saw the same pattern everywhere: civilizations expanding beyond their means, ignoring the cost, worshipping growth while reality unraveled beneath their feet. But it wasn't until he stood among the ruins of Genocide, watching yet another world collapse under its own excess, that something inside him snapped, not in anger, but in certainty. The universe wasn't just broken. It was refusing to heal. Genocide was the final confirmation. A planet rich in spirit, poor in foresight. Thanos watched as leaders debated and delayed, even as their people suffered. He did not interfere at first, he waited, hoping they would see. But they didn't. And when the chaos finally consumed them, he made a vow: never again would he wait for permission. From that moment, intervention became his new purpose. But it wasn't rage that moved him, it was cold, mathematical resolve. Emotion, he had decided, was the enemy of survival. And so, he began to change, not from within, but around the void where feeling used to live. Psychologists call it moral disengagement. The process by which a person distances themselves from the emotional consequences of their actions. For Thanos, this wasn't about cruelty, it was efficiency. He began to view life not as sacred, but as a variable in a cosmic equation. Where others saw faces, he saw imbalance. The weight of emotion was discarded in favor of calculation. What remained was a mind that operated outside of empathy, guided not by pain, but by an urgent sense of mission. He was no longer a citizen of any world. He had become an instrument of balance. But change rarely goes unnoticed. Whispers began to spread across the galaxy, of a figure visiting dying planets and leaving them, corrected. Populations halved, chaos subdued, balance restored. To some, he was a legend, to others, a shadow to be feared. Yet none understood the internal fracture that made such logic possible. He had stopped questioning himself long ago. He had become the answer to the question no one dared to ask. But answers, when unchallenged, can become something else entirely, something colder, deeper, irreversible. And it was there, in the silence between logic and legacy, that the transformation finalized. The man who once begged to be heard now moved through galaxies unheard. But something new was awakening, something that didn't just want to balance the universe, it wanted to reshape it. The shift wasn't sudden, it was methodical. Over time, Thanos refined his ideas not into plans, but into doctrines. The universe, he believed, was sick, and like a surgeon with steady hands, he would cut away the infection. He assembled followers, not through force, but persuasion. He spoke not of domination, but of purpose. The universe requires correction, he would say, and mercy is the chain that keeps us from doing what must be done. They listened, not because they feared him, but because he made sense. And slowly, the line between villainy and vision blurred. Within the inner sanctums of his growing fleet, the world began to take shape as he saw it, precise, calculated, and free from emotional interference. He created a hierarchy not based on power, but on loyalty to the mission. Those who followed understood the rules, efficiency above all, no exceptions. Every action had a price, and every life, a value. And at the center of it all was the Infinity Gauntlet. An idea that had not yet formed into obsession, but was already echoing in his thoughts. A perfect instrument for perfect balance. Not control. Correction. Neurologically, Thanos' evolution reflects a rare phenomenon observed in high-functioning ideologues, cognitive compartmentalization. This is when the brain creates isolated chambers for logic and morality, allowing an individual to carry out acts that seem ethically impossible while still believing in their righteousness. He was not suppressing guilt, he was eliminating it altogether. By segmenting empathy from action, he became capable of decisions few minds could endure. He wasn't becoming a monster. He was becoming something far more disturbing, consistent. As he enacted his version of salvation on planet after planet, his voice became legend. Cultures began to tell stories, not of evil, but of the one who brought balance. Some hated him, yes, but others began to wonder. Would the chaos have ended without his hand? Were the survivors truly worse off? Thanos did not need their praise. Their silence was enough. In his view, the absence of rebellion meant agreement. And where there was no agreement, there would soon be no chaos. He didn't force them to understand. He simply removed their chance to oppose. But beneath the discipline, beneath the logic, something darker stirred. Not ambition. Not cruelty. But a single question that began to echo louder with each success: if balance is achieved through correction, what happens if the imbalance returns? It was no longer theory. It was action. When Thanos first touched the Soul Stone, something within him fractured, not in pain, but in clarity. He now understood, true balance required sacrifice, not just of others, but of self. It was not cruelty, it was necessity. And when he traded what he held most dear to claim that stone, he crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He did not flinch. He did not weep. He simply watched as the universe allowed it, and in that silence, he heard approval. Or at least, the absence of resistance. This was not conquest. It was purification. With each stone he acquired, he saw less of what was and more of what should be. His former doubts dissolved into a kind of holy detachment. Even the most sacred bonds, those of love, kinship, identity, were stripped away in pursuit of the greater good. And in this new self, there was no room for contradiction. His logic became his law. The gauntlet was no longer a tool, it was destiny forged into form. But beneath that gold shimmer lay something ancient, the idea that only through absolute loss could absolute balance be achieved. Ethics, as philosophers understand it, is often a negotiation between idealism and reality. But Thanos had severed that negotiation. In his mind, he had eliminated moral subjectivity. He was now operating within what psychologists call instrumental rationality. A state in which actions are only valued for their utility toward a defined outcome, not for their intrinsic right or wrong. The snap was not born out of hatred. It was born from this sterile, unshakable logic: fewer lives meant more resources. Less chaos meant longer survival. The equation, he believed, was flawless. And yet, that is where the horror truly begins, not in the act itself, but in how logical it appears. Viewers and survivors alike are forced into a dilemma. If the universe truly was on the brink, if every model pointed toward collapse, then wasn't doing nothing just as cruel? Thanos never asked for followers, he offered no sermons. He left only aftermaths and decisions. The kind that governments, philosophers, and survivors would argue about for decades. Not because they agreed with him, but because they couldn't disprove him without doubting themselves. And as the dust settled, quite literally, across galaxies, one question lingered in the ruins of countless civilizations, echoing like a riddle with no answer: what if, in some cold and quiet corner of the universe, he was right? The most disturbing aspect of Thanos' vision wasn't the destruction, it was the logic behind it. Economists have long debated the concept of scarcity: when resources are limited, someone must go without. In this cold framework, Thanos offered a permanent solution: cut the demand. Halve the population. End the crisis. It was mathematical, not emotional. In the calculus of extinction, he saw equilibrium. And while most would recoil from such a conclusion, he leaned into it with unsettling calm. To him, horror was not failure, it was efficiency misunderstood. From a psychological lens, Thanos operated under what is known as utilitarian extremism, a deviation of classical utilitarianism where the ends not only justify the means, but erase them. His mind had undergone what neuroscientists call a cognitive shift. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and moral reasoning, was now serving only one directive: maximize long-term benefit, regardless of short-term pain. In clinical studies, this detachment is seen in individuals with high-functioning moral dissociation. They can simulate empathy, but suppress it in action. And so, the gauntlet became not a weapon, but a calculator, channeling the energy of 6 cosmic constants into one act of enforced balance. Thanos didn't choose randomly, his snap followed a perfect distribution pattern. No bias. No emotion. Just a reset button pulled straight from theoretical models of ecological stability. In fact, real-world parallels exist. In controlled ecosystems, biologists have documented cases where forced population reductions lead to short-term flourishing. But always at a cost. Always with consequences no model fully predicts. This is the horror: he made sense. Not to the heart, but to the data. His logic found its way into debates on energy policy, space colonization, and even artificial intelligence. If a machine were told to save the universe, and given no moral restrictions, would it not land on the same answer? This is what haunts us. That beneath all our ethics, all our feelings, there is a blueprint of cold survival that mirrors his every move. Not because we agree, but because we understand. And that understanding is far more dangerous than belief. And in that final moment, as half of all life faded into dust, Thanos did not smile with pride, but with certainty. He hadn't acted out of emotion. He had followed the numbers. The universe, he believed, would thank him in time. Because this wasn't madness. This wasn't chaos. It was cold, deliberate calculation. When the dust settled, literally and metaphorically, the universe didn't applaud. It didn't scream. It simply adjusted. Ecosystems began to flourish. Traffic stopped. Skies cleared. Cities, though broken, grew quieter. Some whispered that maybe, just maybe, Thanos was not entirely wrong. But peace built on disappearance is fragile. What he left behind was more than silence. It was a moral vacuum, a question echoing through every surviving mind: if survival requires sacrifice, who gets to decide who stays? The myth of Thanos did not end with his retreat to that quiet farm. That image, him watching the sunrise in silence, became a symbol. To some, it was the ultimate villain, the destroyer of worlds. To others, a twisted savior who did what no one else dared. Generations later, scholars debated his actions as though dissecting a fallen philosopher. Politicians quoted him in fear. Scientists studied his logic in awe. Survivors, however, just lived in the absence of those they had lost, caught between grief and the bizarre relief that followed. Philosophically, Thanos left us with a dilemma rooted in the oldest ethical conflict: deontology versus consequentialism. Should morality be judged by action or result? He chose result. And in doing so, stripped morality of meaning. He rewrote ethics not as a code of compassion, but as a system of outcomes. In that model, feelings became inefficiencies, empathy a distraction. His snap was not a cry for war, it was an equation made manifest. And yet, the cost was not just lives, it was something harder to quantify: hope. But the universe, like trauma, remembers. And in time, the balance he forced began to falter. The unnatural order cracked. The silence became unbearable. The illusion of peace faded under the weight of what was lost. Because what Thanos never calculated was the soul. The intangible force that resists logic. That cries out for connection, meaning, love. And when that force awakened again, it fought not just to restore what had been erased, but to remind reality that survival without purpose is just another form of extinction. Still, the myth remains. Not in temples or monuments, but in a single question that refuses to die: what if he wasn't the last? He wasn't a monster born of rage, but of reason. Thanos forced us to face a truth we'd rather ignore: that logic, without compassion, can become its own form of devastation. He didn't destroy out of hate. He calculated. And in doing so, he left behind not just ruins, but a question that lingers in every corner of the cosmos: if he was wrong, why does part of us still understand him?